Well, our next speaker is Michael Shaw. And Michael is an attorney, a businessman, very successful businessman, who has really cut back tremendously on his business so that he can spend full time trying to educate people about these entities of sustainable development and Agenda 21 and this effort to control our property rights. For without property rights, there are no human rights. There is no freedom. The foundation of our freedom is based really upon the ability of each and every one of us to own our property. So Michael lives in Santa Cruz, where I do. We call it affectionately the People's Republic of Santa Cruz. And for 20 years, Michael has been launching an effort to get the right to do with a piece of property. He basically doesn't want to develop it and make it a lot of money. He wants to develop it and make it into a beautiful garden, which he has. And this is many, many acres of land. He just wanted to restore it to its natural beauty, but the government doesn't want him to do that. For some reason, they want to regulate every aspect of what we do, because there are people who have a different world vision, a different world view. And Santa Cruz is sort of a trial for that sort of thing. So Michael has been involved for almost 20 years in a long-standing battle with the local planning commission, and he has brought legal action against them. He's been on the front lines of this battle really all across the country. A member of Freedom 21, which is a national organization. He's developed a local branch called Freedom 21 Santa Cruz. For many years, he did a radio program locally, which was actually heard all throughout the country on Freedom 21 Santa Cruz radio. He's totally dedicated to the preservation of America. I'm glad to call him a friend. Michael, please come.
America has been swamped with a costly policy program that is increasingly supported by the courts across this country. The program is centered squarely upon the elimination of private property and free enterprise. It is swarming the country under the warm and fuzzy term, sustainable development. How many people in the audience are familiar to some level with the ideas of sustainable development? Okay, thank you. Sustainable development has become the popularized expression for Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is the 1992 United Nations Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development. Agenda 21 defines itself as the comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations systems, governments, and major groups in every area in which humans impact on the environment. Well, that doesn't leave anything. My goal in the next few minutes is to describe the origin, the general nature, and the implementation of sustainable development / Agenda 21, and illustrate how this global comprehensive plan is transforming the American systems of government, justice, and economics. Back in the 1990s, my exposure to Agenda 21 followed this pattern. I was a director on the local Santa Cruz County Resource Conservation District, which worked with the federal government's Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation System. And while doing that and having federal officials come to our meetings to proclaim the need for such things as wildland fires, that wildland fires were only not to be precluded, they were to be encouraged. And in this process, I found out about a local Agenda 21 program. Now, Santa Cruz is only one of 3 counties in the country that has called their Agenda 21 program Agenda 21. Here in Sonoma, it's called 2020. The conditions of Santa Cruz since that time have begun to show the effects of 2020. Our forest lands, the redwood forest in the Santa Cruz Mountains, can't be timbered very easily. And now in over half the mountain, it is illegal to timber the redwoods. They're growing so close that the fire is only a matter of time before it chases the people out of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Only last month, the California Supreme Court, a 4-3 decision, said that it's, for the first time in the history of the state, it's not necessary if the state enforce timber policies. They granted all timber-making policies to the County Board of Supervisors in Santa Cruz. 2 weeks ago, our farmers lost a case that came as a result of a 1980s action which began the monitoring of all farmers' water in Santa Cruz County. In the 90s, the farmers began to be taxed on the drawing of their own water from their own wells. Today, that is up to $200 an acre foot. They finally sued. They, of course, lost in the Santa Cruz County Superior Courts, went to the appellate courts in San Jose, and shockingly, in the state that has had the strongest water rights in the history of the world, they lost there too. Notwithstanding the fact that the California Supreme Court only 2 days earlier had decided a similar case in Santa Barbara oppositely. So what did the San Jose Appellate Court do? Well, they simply depublished the opinion, so the farmers now cannot even appeal to the Supreme Court. Santa Cruz is the leading county in California for the implementation of sustainable development. But the sad news is that other counties are following and following quickly. A former mid-level operator in the Santa Cruz Planning Department for many years has now, for about a decade or so, been the planning director here in Sonoma County. His name is Pete Parkinson. Well, Mr. Parkinson is quickly and relatively suddenly imposing Santa Cruz types ordinances all over Sonoma County. Now, this isn't the only other county in California with these problems. Every county has the problem, and they're accelerating. But they're clearly accelerating here in Sonoma very rapidly, as I realized from the stack of 70 pages of local newspaper articles describing the creekside ordinances, which are sampled out of after Santa Cruz. In Santa Cruz, we've got a 2-lane freeway system. We need 4. But what we're getting is hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money to take a dilapidated rail line that Southern Pacific wants to put in the hands of somebody else so that a commuter line can be built along the railroad track. That'll be followed by 14-story buildings where people will live and stack them and pack them units, where developers, or so-called sustainable developers, will build these high rises with federal dollars. In fact, Santa Cruz has received a $300 million federal grant to build the first 3,000 of these stack them and pack them units. That's an 800 square foot unit that the developer gets $100,000 from the federal government just to begin to build. The County Board of Supervisors said, if you are a sustainable developer, you're immune from any construction defect liability. It's a partnership between selected developers building this new world order and the government using the American taxpayer dollars in order to do it. There is a fast approach to make sustainable development happen here, there, and all across this country. The net effect is going to be that it's going to bankrupt the dollar and bring us into a North American currency situation just like the Europeans. There's a man named Gary Lawrence who was an advisor to the United States President's Council. This was President Clinton, his Council on Sustainable Development. We don't hear these words, but boy, it's all over Washington, D.C. It's all around Congress. He was a U.S. government delegation member to the United Nations 1996 Habitat II Conference. He's a director for the Center for Sustainable Communities at the University of Washington and a chief planner for the city of Seattle. There are a lot of people all over this state with that kind of pedigree who are working behind the scenes to restructure our life for the purpose of eliminating private property. When he was at a United Nations meeting in 1998 in London, he said the following: participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we call our processes something else, such as comprehensive planning, that's what the state of Wisconsin uses, growth management, or as we use here in California, smart growth. We have a governor that's probably the second biggest advocate for smart growth of any of the governors in the United States. Terms today that are used are terms like visioning, common, 2020, welcome Sonoma, community plan, and others are used. These programs are always said to be locally driven, but comparisons show remarkable similarities, evidencing a top-down system that conforms to Agenda 21's comprehensive plan blueprint. It is a global to local scheme facilitated with federal dollars and the change agents that our universities are pouring out by the thousands every year. The sustainable goal is the elimination of the middle class. You can say, "Now, Michael, the middle class is doing fine in America today. We're pumping out so many dollars that it's relatively easy for someone to get by." But you see, it's the pumping out of the dollars that creates the conditions, along with the infrastructure that is being changed in our country, and the bogus attacks on automobile use and suburban housing, that as the dollar begins to implode, will leave this country without the middle class the sustainable developers desire. The green goal includes the listing in a 1,300-page book that came out of the 1992 Rio Conference, sponsored by the United Nations, of what's not sustainable. And as you go through this 1,300 pages, it just goes on and on and on. But a couple of the examples include private property is deemed by those who are running the sustainable programs in all our communities to be not sustainable. Golf courses and ski lodges, irrigation is not sustainable. The world cannot support 6 billion people if we don't irrigate our farms. But you see, the plan behind sustainable development includes population control. It's a program for land use control, education control, and population control. The leaders of the sustainable movement, including people like Dr. Michael Soule from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and David Foreman, who's focused on the Wildlands Project, which I'll talk about in a minute, say that the world's human population should not exceed 500 million people. That's a 93% reduction of today's population levels. Monotheism is not sustainable, according to the Sustainable Development Guide. Commercial agriculture and the family unit are not sustainable. Sustainable developers have a symbol. It's an interconnecting situation with 3 circles. Each circle represents one of the 3 basic E's for the sustainable developers. The first E is the idea of equity. Equity means to use the law to re-engineer humanity. Instead of concepts of private property and equal justice, it's run by a system of social justice. If you have a 20-year-old child, they've never even heard the notion of equal justice. They've only heard social justice. And with social justice comes, quote, environmental justice and the precautionary principle. You see, the precautionary principle is in the minds of our youth, replacing notions of equal justice. The precautionary principle holds that no human being can take any action that might cause harm. That's why the federal government came into Santa Cruz with its habitat conservation plan and proposed 97 species for special protection that required each landowner who might prospectively, not actually, prospectively have a certain species of plant or animal or bug on their property to do the following. In the case of the long-toed salamander, you couldn't walk on your property during the wintertime because it was its mating season. And if you did walk on your property, your duty under the law, right out of the dark ages, was that you had to prove you didn't step on one. And of course, proving the negative as a basis for justice is the definition of tyranny. If you have a child in the Los Angeles City School District, that means a third grader, they're taught precisely the principles of the precautionary principle. The second E is economy. Now, economy doesn't mean trade, freely given, as we all presume economy to mean. It means the redistribution, the international redistribution of America's wealth. That's why we have policies like NAFTA and CAFTA, to break down the American producer, to give favored treatment to other producers in this hemisphere. It is the effort to destroy the free enterprise farmer, the free enterprise manufacturer, and free enterprise itself. The economy means the replacement of free enterprise with public-private partnerships. Well, Hitler called that for what it is, a public-private partnership, a system of economics based on public-private partnership. The term we hear all the time today is more simply and directly defined as fascism. Fascism was not a system of justice, it was a system of economics. And if you remember the movie Schindler's List, he simply was doing the government's business. Public-private partnership. But the third E takes precedence over all else, and it flows in from the top. It's all about the environment. The environment in this context has no end but to put nature above man. The United States government's support for Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, is very clear. You won't find it in newspapers, because newspapers, that tight little grouping of people who own newspapers in America today, are themselves sustainable developers. So we don't hear what's happening. But if you dig into the work and you find out who's doing what, it becomes very evident at every level. In 1992, while the Rio Conference was going on, George Bush, then president, was there, not on ground, he was just offshore in Prince Charles's yacht, where he executed the Agenda 21 protocols on behalf of the United States and brought it back to Washington, D.C. Within a year, Bill Clinton, by executive order, no congressional review, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. It included a who's who of the environmental groups, included all of the secretaries of the cabinet, and it had a couple of business people. The chairman of California's Pacific Gas and Electric was one of the three. Ken Lay of Enron was another one. In 1997, the counties and mayors created the Joint Center for Sustainable Communities. And in 2001, the National Governors Association endorsed smart growth. Well, I'll explain what smart growth is in a little bit, but just understand that in essence, smart growth is the urban element of the land use dynamic of sustainable development. We've got to go back and understand the nexus of what causes sustainable development to be an issue in our lives every day. The United Nations is at the center of the sustainable development movement. In 1976, at their Habitat 1 conference, they said, quote, "Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of the accumulation and concentration of wealth. and therefore contributes, here's that term again, to social injustice. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable. Now, your 100-foot setbacks from intermittent streams in this county is a first big step toward achieving this end. We've done it in Santa Cruz. We did it before anybody knew what sustainable development was. In fact, we had that done with Pete Parkinson as part of the routine before the world knew what sustainable development was, before 1992. Santa Cruz has been a test case in the country and for around the world for the policies of sustainable development. The voters passed a measure called Measure C, Decade of the Environment, in 1990, which looks just like what came out of Rio de Janeiro 2 years later. And now counties around the state and around the country are following Santa Cruz. Sustainable development has two land use action plans. The first one is the so-called Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project calls for the elimination of human presence on over 50% of the American landscape and heavily controlled activity on most of the rest of American land. Think about that. The land of the free and the home of the brave now has a federal government, a state government, and local governments everywhere working to achieve this end. Reminds me of Vladimir Lenin's statement about how it is he gets his bureaucrats to do the dirty work for him. He said, most of them don't need to know what we're after. Most of our bureaucrats are simply useful idiots. We only need a few to understand our goals. And that philosophy has swamped the American governmental operations at the federal, state, and local level. This is a map of the Wildlands Project. It was prepared in 1994 based on documents that had been smuggled out of the UN headquarters in Geneva. These documents were smuggled out by a few brave Americans, Michael Kaufman from Maine being primary amongst them, in order to get this information to the United States Congress before it was ready to pass the Wildlands Biodiversity Treaty, which was the product along with Agenda 21 that came out of the 1992 UN conference in Rio de Janeiro. To explain the map, the red are areas that are to be off limits to human beings. No resource development, no human activity. If you live there, you won't. The yellow areas are the areas for major control of all human activity. If you live there, you won't. The black areas, the black dots, are the smart growth zones. That's where human beings are to be stacked and packed in small living units along rail tracks. The smart growth program ultimately has jobs assigned and children cared for by the state as you board the train for work. These goals are being achieved today. Look at the dam busting that's happening all across the United States. In fact, Hetch Hetchy, the breaking of Hetch Hetchy Dam up in Yosemite, which waters all of San Francisco, is supported both by Senator Feinstein and Senator Boxer. Forest fuel levels are causing massive fires. That's not because of global warming. That's because you can't manage your forest anymore. It's against the law. The dynamic for these massive fires has been planned. Habitat set-asides and conservation easements mean compliant partnering between owners and the government. The result is, if you enter into a conservation easement, you have given up in perpetuity the private property aspect of the property that you've so contracted. The root of all of the wildlands effort is in the Endangered Species Act. The worst fears of many of us from many years ago are coming true as plants, bugs, and animals are deemed more important than people. It is time to repeal, not reform or strengthen, as Congressman Pombo talks about, the Endangered Species Act. America was one of the last countries to take on this legislation, which is everywhere around the world and which was centered in United Nations organizations. You see, when the government controls the natural resources and the land, the government does control or will control all human action. And that's what tyranny is all about. The second element of the land use aspect of sustainable development is so-called smart growth. When Californians threw Gray Davis out of office, they threw the man that put the Wildlands Project in effect in this state. The Sierra is now a 22-county wildlands project. It's called the Sierra Conservancy. And I've spoken in a couple counties up there. People have no idea what's going on. And it strikes me so often that because we don't understand how this is being placed upon us, many people just give up. The excitement about Sonoma is a number of people are rallied against what's wrong. What's needed now is to understand why it is this is coming down on Sonoma and organize so that you get the weed at its root. Because I can tell you one thing about fighting sustainable development policies. If you just go pruning and snipping back the branches, it only fuels it. In Santa Cruz, we had a situation where the public responded because all of the non-farmers' wells were now going to be monitored. And a huge contingent came down to the Board of Supervisors. This was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And they beat it back. Well, the Board of Supervisors hasn't fought, and we're about ready to see them sneak in some regulations to reinstitute the water controls on non-farmers' wells. People in Sonoma need to beat back these creekside ordinances, but don't think that when you've done that, you've won. This is a war, and it will last a long time. Ask your neighbors if they've been lured by the ideas of smart growth. Why it is that so-called sprawl and choice is so bad. Human beings are not sardines. We don't do well when we're all jammed on top of each other. It's a big country. It's a big world. And it's for us to use, enjoy, and protect. That's the nature of human beings. And those who spoil the water or spoil the air need to be criminalized. But those who use the natural resources of our country cannot be precluded unless we are going to allow freedom to slip away, lives to end, and tyranny to begin. Is the development of water resources so bad? Why are we breaking our water resources? You know, the World Bank, now run by the Bush administration, calls for a global limitation for the daily human use of water. It's to be restricted to 10 gallons a day. Well, there are no suburban lots with 10 gallons of water of use per day. It's as though water disappears once you use it. The amount of water on this planet has never changed since the beginning of time. It just changes form and location. And wise use brings water to the needs and uses of people. But the plan is to limit you severely. At 10 gallons of water per day, you don't even take a shower. And what's so distressing about putting more lanes on our freeways in the state? Since Jerry Brown was governor, we don't build new freeways. And it doesn't matter if it's Ronald Reagan or Arnold Schwarzenegger. You see, this is a bipartisan effort. Sustainable development would not be swiftly and quietly moving through this country if the Republicans and the Democrats weren't solidly behind it at the high levels. I'm not talking about the people. Here's an artist rendering of Freedom 21 Santa Cruz activists of what their ideas for human communities need to be like. It's like living in a feudal age castle where you can't walk outside it. Only modern technology builds these things up and makes them big. You see, one of the wildlands proponents says, when we're done, it'll be the animals on the outside freely roaming the landscape, watching the people on the inside of the walled smart growth communities. The program happening today in Sonoma County about creek setbacks is an early but definite step toward bringing people in from rural areas and packing them in the new age smart growth communities. This is a list of what we call warm and fuzzy expressions. It's a list worth looking at. These are words that used to appear in a dictionary and they had a meaning. In the newspeak of sustainable development, these words don't mean anything that you grew up thinking them to mean. This is the newspeak understood by those working the inside for bringing us this new world order. I've talked about environment, economy, and equity, but consensus. You see, it used to be that if there were public engagements, there'd be a set of rules you'd go by so that both sides could hear and they could fight it out and the public could hear. It was called the Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order don't exist anymore. You go into these community consensus meetings, Orlean made mention of some here in Sonoma. They happen all the time in Santa Cruz. Consensus means you go along. It's a preconceived outcome with tactics used by trained facilitators to get the audience to the end point. As the public begins to understand what's going on, the rules ratchet down and the public is then put in a little table of 6 people. They assign the 6. There's always a facilitating leader at these tables of 6 people. And if you've got a comment you want to have shared with the audience, the facilitator excludes the comments that don't support the predetermined conclusion. And there's no public way for you to raise your hand and say, what about this? There is no debate. Consensus is the local process for bringing about the New World Order, which is devoid of the idea and ideals of property rights. Common good. Decided by whom? Restoration. What are we talking about? Restoration. This is the year 2006. By restoration, they mean make this landscape look like it did in 1492. That's literally what they mean. So much for farming. You know, I work to create an environment of native plants of what we call Liberty Garden on the coast of Santa Cruz. And the one thing I can tell you for sure is that if you've got rid of all the weed seeds in this entire state, you're not going to recreate 1492 any more than the Indians of 1492 with their massive fires in order to make the California landscape blossom could have made that landscape the way it was in 1 AD or 1000 BC. things change. Best management practices. That means if you don't do it the federal government, meaning the United Nations way, you'd be kicked off your land. Best management practices are a one-way answer to questions that they can't even ask, much less find a workable answer to. Regional. Regionalism, as Charlotte Iserbyt says, is communism. Regional boards exist all across the state, from water quality to air quality. Nobody elects them, but they make all the rules that restrict what you can do, and they're going to make a whole lot more in the next decade. See, when Ronald Reagan said it's time to remake California government, he said, because California government is horse and buggy, Ronald Reagan was wrong. It is a system of local control that is essential to a free society, and it is the regionalization by control boards that is the essence of tyranny. The infrastructure has been set up over the last 3 or 4 decades. We need to build numbers so we can roll that back. You see, the planned evolution utilizes change agents to bring about a process that they call action. Now, action sounds like a fine word, but it too is a code word for the implementers of sustainable development. I have here the Santa Cruz County Local Agenda 21. It's called a Sustainable Community Action Plan, Our Agenda for the 21st Century. This is being implemented step by step by the County Board of Supervisors. But on the back, they tell you what action means. It's Agenda 21, community, teamwork, in operation now. You see, that teamwork is to change us from a system of self-governance to one of global collectivism. Our foundation is one that leads to liberty. The American foundation is one predicated upon liberty, which is based upon the ideals of unalienable rights, which preserve for each human being their life, their liberty, and their property. You break any of that system of flow, and you end up with tyranny. Global collectivism is about the establishment of tyranny. It is based on the United Nations concept of human rights. And that means we work toward a system of social equity, a new economy, public-private partnership, and a new system of justice, environmental justice. This is happening in every county across the country. Very few locales have gotten the message in a sufficient way to be able to fight it at its root, because the more you break off the branches, the more it grows. You've got to get it at the root, explain to others what is happening, and understand yourself what its effects are. You say, well, how does all this happen? There's a lot of organizations, and I'm not going to spend all day talking about them, but I'll give an example. One of the organizations that is working the global effort for sustainable development is called ICLEI. That's an acronym for the organization called the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. This is a UN NGO. NGO means non-governmental organization. It also means to be an NGO, you are accredited by the United Nations for purposes of implementing sustainable development. The American Farm Bureau is an NGO. The Chamber of Commerce is an NGO. You'd be shocked at all the organizations that you belong to that are NGOs. ICLEI is one of them. This is from their 1997 website, and it shows San Francisco, San Jose, Santa Cruz County, and Santa Monica as Californian cities 10 years ago that were members of ICLEI. In its own words, ICLEI is an international association of local governments implementing sustainable development. An international organization of local governments. Our federal government is feeding the idea of creating a global system of global to local, meaning global governance over local areas, eliminating nations. And I don't care who the next president is, he will be a sustainable developer. The Republican Party is a member of the International Democrat Union. So is the Conservative Party in England and 80 other parties around the country. The International Democrat Union calls for the implementation on a global basis of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. That is the end of America. The IDU meets every 4 years in whatever city the Republican Party meets in, with very high security, and high-level Republicans run back and forth between the two conferences. Nothing needs to be said about the Democrat Party. It's pretty obvious that they are globalist in nature. Americans have no alternative today when it comes to the political machinery. Give it to the right, give it to the left. We'll bake. Our federal government agencies are also very clear in their commitment. Remember, I told you that President Clinton made sure that all agencies became implementers of sustainable development. This is the Department of Agriculture. No wonder our farmers are in such trouble. It's very clear from their website that sustainable development is a central piece of USDA policy, making a sustainable difference, they say, as they advertise the United Nations World Summit on Sustainable Development. Farm policies, starting with NAFTA, are all about implementing sustainable development. When I say farm policies, I mean federal farm policies. As American agriculture goes, so goes the American people. So we've got to pause and ask ourselves, which philosophy of rights do we want to work toward? And at this point, it gets pretty simple. Because if you boil down all the sophistications, it's a contrast between two systems of government that human beings today are faced with having a choice of. One is the ideas of individual rights, and they're predicated upon the United States Declaration of Independence, probably the greatest achievement in all of human history was that document, what's contained in it. You see, the purpose of government under our Declaration is that government serves to protect the natural or unalienable rights of each of us. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Republican Party's dedication to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights deserves a little bit of a look. See, the purpose of government under that concept is that the control of the individual for the greater good of a global community. In Article 29, Section 3 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it says, quote, "Rights and freedoms may be in no case exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations." Well, who are the men behind the black curtain at the UN? They're the ones deciding what rights and freedoms exist for whom and for when. Do you really think it's Kofi Annan? You see, in short, under the American system, you're born with rights and government exists to protect those rights. You and the product of your labor belong to you. But under the emerging system of global governance, government will grant, restrict, and withdraw your rights according to its needs. You and the product of your labor belong to the community. President Bush, 3 years ago, said, quote, "The United States of America is committed to the United Nations, and we show that commitment by working to fulfill the UN's stated purposes and give meaning to its ideals. We'll have no less of a commitment to the UN from Hillary Clinton or John McCain or Al Gore or John Kerry or any other name you can think of who might be the next president." See, political globalists are moving toward a form of what I'll call state capitalism. It's an assault on land, and that's where we have to stand up and protect our land and protect our neighbor's land. It's about the growth of public-private partnerships and the growing war on free enterprise. Other Agenda 21 issues to put your eyes on are the human health care issues, which are increasingly calling for the surrender of individuality to sustainability. We're embedding a system of, quote, comprehensive planning. It is, in the words of Al Gore, the reinvention of government. Christianity is being redefined toward a global religion. Who's going to win that race? It is about the central control of education, as Orlean talked about. Our schools are building global citizens and human drones. It's about globalist trade policy. And it designs the creation of monetary uncertainty. The Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis last month had a writing from one of its principals calling the American government bankrupt. Think about that. The Federal Reserve would live on. They'd just substitute one form of funny money for another form of funny money. But the American government would be bankrupt. I'd like to do this chart to summarize how the sustainable developers are organized. On the right, as we move toward this collectivist one world, we've got public-private partnerships. Okay, the few guys who will take federal money to build government housing that's advertised as a leftist movement. But it's the few guys working for those partnerships that come from the right side of this political spectrum. On the left side, it's all those advocates of social justice. Treat everyone fairly. Protect the environment. You see, those are the two sides of one coin. That coin is sustainable development. Sustainable development is a government-controlled society. It's tyranny. You got smart growth, and you got the Wildlands Project. It's Agenda 21, usually championed by the left. Regionalism, championed by the right. Collectivism, championed by the left. And the UN Charter, amazingly, I'll claim, is championed by the right. But together, they're working toward a common end. Americans are asked to subscribe to one team or the other, as though there's a choice in being on one side or the other of a two-sided coin. Whether you get government education On the left or the right, Bush and Kennedy were the champion partners for the No Child Left Behind legislation, which decimates learning in America. We've got fraud coming from the left with their environmental shenanigans. We've got an interventionist military policy coming from the right. And when we end up, we're living in a police state. The left and the right are not the answers to what ails America. They are the problem. You see, liberty is based on freedom. And freedom requires the development of human conscience. And the system that does that is parenthood. And a society that relies on family first is a society that learns to express itself in a way that's constructive and associate in a way that's productive. And trade, honest free trade, results from that. Freedom brings us genuine peace, not the kind of peace of a no-war policy, but the freedom, the peace that comes through individual liberty and private property and the willingness to stand up to defend those ideas. And if that's the condition of a society, we end up with prosperity and abundance. And the greatest foundation in the history of humankind for that kind of society is the Declaration of Independence. So I suggest that we need to look at the political spectrum as an up-down political spectrum. Liberty at the top, tyranny at the bottom. Understand that it's the Declaration and building a society predicated upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence that brings us liberty. And if we fall for the sustainable development, global to local dynamic of stealing private property with such things as 100-foot setbacks from your own property on both sides, that we begin the downward road that we're already on, called sustainable development. And that's what must be understood and fought. If we're to declare our independence, we'll need to follow the principles of liberty. If we want freedom and abundance, we've got to maintain parental control, not federal control, over how our children are educated. We need a defensive military policy, not a military policy that brings the world to its knees while we all fight each other so that the globalist order takes place. Individual liberty and economic liberty are partners in this effort. Free expression and free association for each of us. Free enterprise and private property as one chooses. Freedom 21 Santa Cruz, we're happy to be working with organizations around the country. The word is beginning to seep out. You can visit our table in the back. We have brochures that are circulating through the country that are short, easy to understand. There's a lot more work. We have a website with thousands of references, many from Santa Cruz and this section of California, but from all over the country, and readership from around the world. It's important to know what we're dealing with. You can't fight an enemy you don't know, because they just will appear and reappear, and if you don't understand their essence, you won't be able to anticipate and fight. There are thousands of attacks that are going on right now. We have DVDs, including America's Choice, Liberty or Sustainable Development, with 6 speakers from around the country speaking on this issue in more detail. A DVD called Taking Liberty, done by Dr. Michael Kaufman, who did the map I showed earlier, that shows how that map, done in 1994, it shows its current status. The current status is nearly what was shown back in 1994. In other words, the Wildlands Project is moving across this country. I ask you, if you're at all interested, to sign up for our periodic reports, which will bring you information somewhat irregularly, giving you the kind of information you need and that you want to spread around, so that here in Sonoma County you can take a good, strong lead in staving off the ruin of America, otherwise called sustainable development. Thank you.
Well, where did we come from? Why are we here? Those are the questions that philosophers have asked since the beginning of time. Of course, if you ask the philosophers what it's about, they will tell you that, well, life is tough and then you die. Man came out of nothing and is going no place. Life, there's certainly no good deed will ever go unpunished. Life is sort of a matter of quiet desperation, but somehow or rather maybe having children has to do with why we're here. Or perhaps we're like the rock who worships nothing. Perhaps there is no meaning for life at all. The philosopher really doesn't know why we're here. Originally, of course, America was founded by Christians on Christian principles. Our nation was to be unique because the power of the central authority over the lives of the people was to be limited by the chains of the Constitution, and men were to be free. This was a unique concept in that man was to be ruled by God. In other words, we weren't to be ruled by government, and God wasn't going to rule the government. We were going to be ruled ourselves, and then we could be free because we would not need an all-powerful government. For as William Penn had said so well, those who will not be ruled by God will be ruled by tyrants. So these principles of America that have been outlined, and you've heard them outlined, were so vitally important to the establishment of the nation that we've lived in. But the nation we live in today is not the nation that I lived in 70 years ago when I was born. I was born actually 77 years ago. America has changed. And the Christianity of today is not the Christianity of half a century ago. Today we have a God without wrath, who deals with men without sin, to take them into a heaven without judgment, through Christ without a cross. And the principles, the concepts of Christianity seem to have changed and changed dramatically, and nobody ever asked why both the music and the message of the church has altered. And I would like to suggest to you that there are other men. These other men have a different worldview because they worship a different God, because they have a different goal. And I'm going to tell you about this today and try to put it into perspective so you can understand these concepts of Agenda 21. What is Agenda 21? It is the agenda for the 21st century you're living in today, for a brave new world where everything that you cherished and held true will no longer exist. Sustainable development, which is a program for government control over every aspect of our lives. And how does this come about, and who are these men, and why are these things happening? Well, the year before I was born, that is in the year 1928, a man named Edward Bernays wrote a book called Propaganda. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and this is how he began his book. The intelligent and intentional manipulation of the occupational habits and the views of the individual is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this essential mechanism constitute an invisible government, which is the true rulers of our country. Our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. And Edward Bernays knew what he was talking about. When I went to medical school, and I entered in 1948, cancer of the lung was almost unheard of in women. It was quite common in men because men were used to smoking. So the American Tobacco Company hired Edward Bernays to put on a massive program to convince women to smoke. and by using slogans, slick little slogans like reach for a smoke, not a sweet. By having in movies pictures, you know, the heroine was always smoking a cigarette, and by the advertisements you saw in newspapers and magazines. You gradually convince women that they should go ahead and smoke, and as a result, the second largest cause of cancer in women today is cancer of the lung, thanks to Edward Bernays, who was responsible for the deaths of millions of Americans. He was hired by the U.S. Public Health Service to convince the American people that water fluoridation was good for our children. And what you do not know is what the scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency and the engineers at the Environmental Protection Agency and the lawyers who work for the EPA, their union has a website. And I hope you'll go to it, and I hope you'll write it down. www.nteu280. That's www.nteu280. I want you to go there. And NTEU is the National Treasury Employment Union. Don't ask me what that has to do with the EPA, but their union. Actually, it's 11 unions that represent them. And there they will tell you that the water fluoridation that is present in 67% of our cities today influences the fertility, lowers intelligence. In fact, in China, they found that in the areas with fluoridated water, why you have about 3 times as many imbeciles and idiots, IQs of 70, and no geniuses. American children, when they graduate from high school today, cannot compete with children who've graduated from the rest of the world. We blame that on the educational system. Nobody wants to suggest that Edward Bernays' system was very successful of putting something into the water that would affect our minds. But don't believe what I say. Go to the union's website and read what's up there. Pull it down and read it. It affects your bones, softens your bones. It affects the menarche of girls. They start 6 to 9 months earlier. It interferes with your endocrine system, interferes with your heart. Actually, it softens your bones. It attacks your thyroid. It increases disability and arthritis. And the average American has never heard of that. Because you see, what Edward Bernays put into action back in the 1940s and 50s, today has been accepted by the American people, because most of what you believe and most of what you think simply is not true. Now, most people believe that America is a democracy. If you read what the president says, we are fighting in Iraq today to bring democracy, but the war in Iraq is only part of a much larger war to bring democracy to the world. And yet America was not formed as a democracy. I mean, when we pledge allegiance to the flag, do we pledge allegiance to the democracy for which it stands? No, of course not. We pledge allegiance to the republic for which it stands. Have you ever read the story about Benjamin Franklin as he was coming out of the Constitutional Convention, and Mrs. Powell came up to him and said, Mr. Franklin, what have you given us? What sort of government? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. If you read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Federalist Papers, you will never once see the mention of the word democracy other than to decry its use. If you read the constitutions of all of our 50 states, every one of them is a republic, not a democracy. Democracies were described in the Federalist Papers, the 10th of them. And you go to the universities where they teach, constitutional law, and they will never mention the 10th of the Federalist Papers, where James Madison said, democracies are air, spectacles of turbulence and contention, are air incompatible with personal security and the rights of property, and are usually as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths. Do you notice an increase in violence in your community and throughout our nation recently as the gangs, the MS-13 gangs, and these other gangs are becoming increasingly violent? And the MS-13 gang, which is being allowed to operate in this country with over 50,000 members, in many of the chapters you can't get in until you've killed somebody. Recently they did a program on 60 Minutes where they interviewed a young woman who'd left the MS-13 and Within a few weeks after she appeared on 60 Minutes, she was murdered. We're moving into a period of increasing violence in this country because we have turned our back on our heritage of freedom and Christianity in this nation, and it did not happen by accident. America is a republic and not a democracy, so why are we fighting in Iraq to bring democracy? And why does the president say this is only part of a much larger war to bring democracy? Well, that is covered in many of my writings. In fact, for those of you who have a chance to get our little pamphlets on the occult hierarchy that rules the world. There are 3 pamphlets, actually, and you need to get all 3 of them and read them through. And they will take you into the writings of the occult people who work within the shadows. And of course, we have the advantage because we read what the other side says. They're very, very flagrant in what they write, knowing full well that you will never hear about it. Most people in America today believe there's global warming. Why? Because Time magazine and Newsweek magazine and U.S. News and the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of the major newspapers, including the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. You have to understand that the front pages of the Wall Street Journal are a bit different than the editorial section. And they will tell you that scientists have agreed almost universally that global warming is a reality, and of course it's directly related to what human beings are doing. And they will point to the fact that the ice caps are melting on the North Pole and the South Pole. And that is absolutely true. I mean, if you look at Mars, the ice caps are melting on Mars. Both the ice caps on the North and the South Pole are melting, and they're melting here in the United States as well. And the snows of Kilimanjaro are receding, and the glaciers are receding, and we are in a program of global warming that has been going on since the 1600s. How many of you have ever wondered why Greenland is called Greenland? If you go and look at it today, sheets of ice, but they tell you the ice is melting on Greenland, and the ice is melting on Greenland. But 1,000 years ago, when Leif Erikson was there, it was green, and there were vineyards there, and there were lush green fields. And then the world went into a period of global cooling, which lasted until the 1600s, and since then we've been in a period of global warming. But human activity has nothing to do with it, and greenhouse gases has nothing to do with it. Dr. Robinson, Art Robinson, is a friend of mine. He was a professor at the Southern University in Southern California. He moved to Oregon, where he heads the Oregon Institute. He's renowned among scientists. I think they all envy him because he got out of the university system where he was subservient to the masters who run the university and the great corporations and the great foundations that finance our universities. And he has his own independent institute, but he sent letters out to the leading scientists in America, and 17,000 scientists wrote back and said, man's activity has nothing to do with global warming. It has to do with the phases of the sun. I mean, it has an effect on Mars. It's having an effect on the United States. But you're not going to read that in your local newspapers, because most of what you read and most of what you hear and what you see is controlled by forces that you have little idea about. And so basically, if you look at this idea of global warming, what are the major greenhouse gases? Who knows what the major greenhouse gas is? It's water. Over 90% of greenhouse gases are water. Carbon dioxide makes up probably less than 3% of greenhouse gases, and then there's methane and a couple of others. The whole idea of global warming is really all about sustainable development that Michael was talking about, and that you really need to get our sustainable development syllabus, because in this syllabus we have the Earth Charter, and the Earth Charter lays out the master plan made up by 3 people who are deeply involved in the occult. One of them is a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, the former dictator of Russia. The second one is Maurice Strong, who until recently was the second most influential man in the United Nations. He really ran the United Nations, and Kofi Annan was simply the front for Maurice Strong. The third man is Stephen Rockefeller, the son of Nelson Rockefeller, one of the most wealthy men in the world. And if you really believe Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are the richest people in the world, you've been reading too much of Life magazine, or Time magazine, or listening to Rush Limbaugh too long. Most of what you know has been created for you, and the Rockefeller family has tremendous power and influence far beyond your great expectations. It was in 1913 when Woodrow Wilson's book, The New Freedom, was published. At that time, Woodrow Wilson, of course, was the President of the United States. And in his book, The New Freedom, he said this. He said, since I've been in politics, men have come to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States are in commerce or in manufacturing, are afraid of someone. They're afraid of something. They know there is a power somewhere, so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Let me repeat that for you. And for those of you who would like to read it, I've actually put together a little form here in the back. And the quotations I'm about to give you actually see the pages from Woodrow Wilson's book, which you probably won't find in your local library. Since I entered politics, men have come to me privately. And some of the biggest men in the United States in the fields of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something, or afraid of somebody. They know there is a power somewhere, so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they best not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Now, Woodrow Wilson thought that somehow this tied into the business interests of that time. He knew that there was a force there, but he really didn't know what it was. Nor did he realize that he himself was controlled by this very force. Because his closest friend, and if you read the story of Woodrow Wilson, you'll always find mention of a man named Edward Mandell House. In fact, Woodrow Wilson referred to Edward Mandell House as my alter ego, a man who I would not make a decision without his advice. And who was House? House was part of the secret group that Wilson knew about but didn't understand. His mind was actually controlled by House. And if you read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, and I hope that many of you want to get it, it's a very simple primer on what's going on, you'll find out that House had supernatural power and had the ability to control men's minds. He controlled not only Woodrow Wilson, he controlled FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Many of the things that Roosevelt did, were actually ideas that were implanted in his mind by Colonel Edward Mandell House. It was 4 years after Woodrow Wilson wrote the statements that we've quoted to you that Ambassador Gerard returned from Germany. And he writes in his book, My First 83 Years in America. He said, as soon as we returned to the United States, the New York Times sent a reporter to my office and asked me who the rulers of America was. And I sat in my office and I gave them a list of 52 men. Frederick Lundberg expanded on that list in his book, The 60 Families. But these are the men who rule America economically. And of course, many of them were my friends. And he said, but of course, some people thought that, I was referring to the political leadership. I was really talking to the economic leadership, but many people felt that was the political leadership as well. It was actually 5 years later, in 1922, when the mayor of New York, John Hyland, wrote an article that was published in the New York Times. And since the article is a little hard to read, we've actually given you here just the typed rendition of it. But basically, we have the original article. And he talked about the invisible government. The mayor of New York wrote an article about the invisible government that controlled America. He likened it to an octopus. An octopus, which of course put out its slimy tentacles to grasp and control what was going on and force people to do its bidding. He said, like the octopus, which exists behind a mechanism of its creation. He was talking about the ink that the octopus can put out that you can't see it. So this octopus, of course, works by controlling the media so you don't know it's there. And he talked about how it literally was in total control. It would destroy anybody who spoke out against it, and specifically the politicians. And then, of course, when I went through Colonel House's papers, you remember it was Colonel House I mentioned who controlled Woodrow Wilson, and then, of course, controlled FDR. And you'll see here a letter I found in in Colonel House's papers at the Sterling Library back in Connecticut at Yale University, where President Roosevelt, writing to Colonel House, made this statement. And you'll see the entire text of the letter. I had a nice talk with Jack Morgan the other day, and he seemed not much worried about some of the things that are going on. But then the real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson. And I'm not wholly accepting the administration of WW. That was Woodrow Wilson. The county is going through a repetition of Jackson's fight for the Bank of the United States, only on a far bigger and broader basis. And Roosevelt thought he was fighting the international financiers, the same ones that Andrew Jackson had been fighting, without realizing he was actually doing their bidding, because the man who was manipulating him was the very man he was writing the letter to, Edward Mandell House, who was deeply involved in the occult. And until people understand that there is another spiritual dimension there that some people have tapped into, and these people have pledged their allegiance to it, you cannot understand the wars of the last century or sustainable development, why we are going in Iraq today, or why we will soon be going into war with Iran. Professor Quigley was a liberal professor who taught at Georgetown University and Princeton, at Harvard and Princeton before he went to Georgetown University. He's best known because he was Bill Clinton's mentor, and when Bill Clinton accepted the Democrat nomination for the President of the United States in 1992, why he mentioned that when he had been a student, he had heard a call and a summons to citizenship from President John Kennedy, but when he was a student at Georgetown University, he heard that summons clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley. Now, Carroll Quigley was one of my favorite people. He was brilliant. He hated people like you and I, had total disdain for the simple people. He referred to them the petty bourgeois who voted for Barry Goldwater. You remember that Barry Goldwater ran for president in '64, and he ran as a man who wanted to cut back on the power of government. Well, Professor Quigley believed we needed an all-powerful government. To regulate every aspect of our lives, we needed a ruling aristocracy, and he identified with them. His book, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, basically talked about this aristocracy, and they were the hope. They were the hope of the world. But then he wrote about the secret society that controls America. And this is what he wrote on page 950. And you can pick a copy of this up back on my table if you'd like to. And I hope this will begin to introduce you to the whole different world. And you will begin to try to prove what I'm saying wrong. And if you don't, that you'll join with us in this epic struggle in which we're engaged today for the very survival of Christian civilization and the souls of men. And I quote, "This myth," and he's speaking about this myth that there is a secret society out there. This myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way that the radical right believes the Communist Act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operation of this network because I've studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. Well, I went through Professor Quigley's papers. I spent many weeks back at Georgetown and going through his papers because I wanted to know about this secret movement, and we have all of his papers cataloged and filed away. And I suddenly came to realize that Professor Quigley, as brilliant as he was, one of the most brilliant historians who is still cited by the historians at Harvard and others as one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. Professor Quigley had all the evidence and clues about what this was about, and he missed it totally. Because although he was right about the secret society, which had been created, he talked about, which became known as the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations is simply a front for this group. He missed totally the spiritual forces which energized this. Now, then I would conclude with an article that appeared in October 30th issue of the Washington Times, 1993. It was written by Richard Harwood, who had been the editorial page writer for the Washington Times, for the Washington Post for many years. In 1993, he wrote this, and he's speaking about the Council on Foreign Relations. The President is a member, so is the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, all 5 of the Undersecretaries, several of the Assistant Secretaries, and the Department's legal advisor. The President's National Security Advisor and his deputy are members. The Director's Central Intelligence Agency, like all previous directors, and the Chairman of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Committee are members. The Secretary of Defense, 3 Undersecretaries, and at least 4 Assistant Secretaries are members. The Secretaries of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Interior, Health and Human Services, and the Chief White House Public Relations man, David Gergen, are members, along with the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate. So much for a two-party system, because the same thing happens with the Republicans. It doesn't matter whether you have the Republicans or Democrats in office. The same people control our foreign and domestic policy. Why do you think the Democrats, although they talk against the war in Iraq, are financing it, voting to finance it? And why do you think that certainly both sides support this whole idea of globalism, doing away with our national sovereignty and transferring the sovereignty of our nation to the United Nations? You have the right, the left, the conservatives, the liberals, the Republicans, the Democrats. Most of our major conservative Christian organizations have been infiltrated and taken over. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I belong to most of them. And you see them. There's one, a very powerful organization I belong to. It was set up to counter the Council on Foreign Relations about 1980, and today it is simply a cheerleading section for the Council on Foreign Relations, and most of our major conservative leaders belong to that organization. I belonged to it for many years. I belong to it for one reason, that's to try to bring the truth to those people, but unfortunately, they're being swayed. They're all supporting this idea we've just got to go to war with the Muslim world. And that's what's happening today. More and more people are intent about us going to war with the Muslim world and bringing about a class of civilizations which will ultimately lead to the financial and moral and perhaps physical destruction of this nation. And these things are not happening by accident. There is a master plan out there that is being followed, and you cannot understand that unless you perhaps read about the occult hierarchy that really rules the world. Because, ladies and gentlemen, behind everything going on today, there are powerful forces. Certainly, Foreign Affairs magazine is published by the Council on Foreign Relations. I've been to their headquarters on several occasions and spent weeks going through their secret papers. By secret, I meant that they were not allowed, and you couldn't go to them unless they were something like 50 years old. And fortunately, I was able to go through some of the older papers there and find out that they were planning on the Second World War in 1938. They were already planning on taking us into the Second World War. The Council on Foreign Relations headquarters is at 5080 68th Street in New York, the Harold Pratt House. The latest issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, that is the one that September-October issue, the lead article is on Al-Qaeda. You all know about Al-Qaeda. We're fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq. As the president has said, we've got to fight Al-Qaeda, the terrorists on the streets of Baghdad, or we'll be fighting them in the streets of New York. And a lot of people believe what he says. After all, he's a Christian president. But if you read the lead article, and I suggest you get it, or you can pull it down off the internet, or you can write to me, and I'll send it to you. The lead article is always the article that they really want the elite. Now, not common folks like you out here, but the elite who rule our country. This is what they want them to know, and the article continues, the massive and expensive Homeland Security apparatus erected since 9/11 may be persecuting some spying and many inconveniences, most and taxing of all, to defend the United States against an enemy that scarcely exists. Against an enemy that scarcely exists. 100,000 Iraqis have died since we attacked that nation. What you do not know is that Saddam Hussein had offered to leave and go to another country, and you can document it in my newsletters. The government of Iraq had offered to allow the United States to come in and supervise elections. They didn't want a peaceful solution. They wanted a battle. They promised the Iraqi generals, by contacting them through intelligence agencies and dropping pamphlets, that the Iraqi generals would just tell their troops to lay down their weapons. Why, we wouldn't do anything. We were going to keep the Iraqi army. We were going to get rid of Saddam. We were going to give them an opportunity for a representative government. And that's why within just a week or so, we were able to get our troops into Baghdad. And then you'd never guess what happened. Why, the president sent a man named Paul Bremer as the presidential envoy to Iraq, superseded and went against the advice of all the generals there, dissolved the Iraqi army, dissolved the Iraqi police force, dissolved the Iraqi civil service. And what do you think happened? You had chaos and anarchy, and 2.5, 3 years later, while we're still fighting, the man, Major General Paul Evans, was assigned the job of building the Iraqi army back up after we did away with the complete Iraqi army, but he wasn't allowed to use any of the non-commissioned officers, so he couldn't get a no army built. The army had promised him 250 people, they gave him 60. He didn't have any supplies. And as he wrote, and we have the articles, if any of you want to check what I'm saying, Major General Paul Evans, he said, I didn't have any men to build an Iraqi army. I'm supposed to build an Iraqi army for a nation of 25 million people with 60 men and no non-commissioned officers. That's like trying to put up a tent without tent poles. And then we wonder why America is still there. But if you understand, ladies and gentlemen, there are powerful spiritual forces that are driving this whole thing, because there is a plan. And there has been a plan really for generations, to bring about a new world order and a new world religion. And when you begin to understand that, so much of what's going on today begins to make sense. Many of you have heard of Michael Shaw talk about sustainable development. And in the process, he talked about something called the Global Biodiversity Assessment. Now, it is 1,152 pages. I don't know how many of you want to read an 1,152-page publication, but we have it summarized here in very, very short order. And they basically talk about the certain things that are not sustainable, like monotheistic beliefs, like the Christian belief, and like the Muslim belief, and like the Jewish belief. They're just not sustainable. In other words, they're going to have to do away with it. Do you know a better way than to have a major war where you pit the Christians against the Muslims? I don't know how many of you remember watching the newspaper, watching television yesterday, where the Pope had made some remarks about the Muslim faith, and suddenly all throughout the Muslim world they're calling for a jihad against the Pope and against the Christian world. And you must understand, because the media is controlled in America, and the media is controlled in the United States by 5 mega corporations. You can get in touch with my ministry, and you can, of course, get all the information on this yellow sheet we have in the back there, how to get our catalog. The book is called The New Media Monopoly. There are 5 mega corporations that control all of the 90% of the media in the United States, and they all tie into the Council on Foreign Relations. Isn't that a coincidence? No, none of this is coincidence. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas are suggested largely by men we have never heard of. So you need to understand what this idea of sustainable development is all about, and really the pattern is laid out fairly well in the Global Biodiversity Assessment. They want to make the world like it was before the white man came. The biggest enemy to the world is humanity itself. There are too many of you useless eaters out here. You're going to have to be eliminated by one means or another. You may not believe that there could be people that really feel that way, but perhaps if you'd like to journey to Elberton, Georgia, you'll actually see on the opening pages here the pictures of the great monument, the American Stonehenge, or the Georgia Guidestones. And you'll actually see the pictures of them here. I've been there. And there, in 8 different languages, comes a message from the pit of hell. There are 10 commandments. They're written in Russian and English, Spanish and Swahili, Hebrew and Arabic and Chinese and one other dialect. And number one is maintain the world population at 500 million in constant balance with nature. Well, that doesn't sound too bad unless you stop and think there's 6 billion people in the world, and they want to maintain the world population at 500 million in constant balance with nature. Who built this? Nobody knows who put the money up for it. A mysterious man came into Elberton in 1979, announced he represented a secret society. He wanted to leave a message for humanity. The only person in town who knew who he was the bank manager, sworn to secrecy. And so they built this. It was dedicated in 1980. The witches have their coven meetings there. The Satanists have their coven meetings. UFOs circulate over the top of it. I've been there. I've talked to the people. Everybody in the town is scared to death. A couple of ministers had the courage to speak out against it, but they're not in Elberton anymore. They were simply forced out of town. How do you make sense out of it? You have to understand that there are many organizations. How many of you know that the fastest growing religion in America today is witchcraft? You can go up on the internet and look up witchcraft, and you'll find, literally well over 1 million entries there. I was on a nationwide television program, and I spoke out about witchcraft and the fact that there really are Luciferian organizations in the United States, and many of the most powerful families in the United States are affiliated with these Luciferian organizations. And you can go to their website. The Lucius Trust grew out of something known as the Lucifer Society. And the Lucius Trust has branches in New York. In fact, they maintain the prayer room at the United Nations. They have branches in New York. They have branches in Geneva, Switzerland. And probably most of you have never heard of the Lucius Society. The Rosicrucians have a temple down in San Jose. How many of you have been to that temple? The Rosicrucians have been around since the 1400s. And they are part of this whole brotherhood of darkness that we talk about. The witch wrote to me. She was incensed by remarks that I'd made on this nationwide television program, and she said, "Why, you don't understand witchcraft. There are black witches, of course, they're bad witches, but there are white witches like me. And I'm a good witch. I mean, all we do is we have our rituals and we just want to contact the beings from the other dimension. We just want to contact the beings from the other dimension. And there is another dimension. There is a spiritual dimension. How many of you watched last year a program called The Medium? It was a story of Alison DuBois, who of course worked for the district attorney. And she was a beautiful blonde woman with 3 beautiful blonde children. It was a very, very popular program. Only it really told too much. Because Alison DuBois, in real life, was a real woman with a family who helped the DA catch the bad guys in real life. And of course, this is what happened on the television program. But how did Alison DuBois catch the bad guys? She was in touch with the other dimension. There is a spiritual dimension, ladies and gentlemen. We're involved in a spiritual battle. Until you understand that, nothing that's going on really makes sense. And our job is to try to introduce you to this other dimension, which is directing the course of human affairs and intent upon destroying the land of the free and the home of the brave. And there really are these forces around here. Now, we hope that you'll want to get this Sustainable Development Syllabus, these pictures that Michael Shaw showed you of the Wildlands Project, the Earth Charter. And you really need to read the Earth Charter to understand anything that's going on today. The Earth Charter is the Mein Kampf for everything going on. As I mentioned earlier, it was written by Mikhail Gorbachev, by Marie Strong, and by Stephen Rockefeller. And it lays out the plan, a 16-point plan, which they refer to as the new 10 Commandments for the world, to replace the old, outmoded 10 Commandments that you foolish people believe in. You believe in the God of the Bible, but these people worship a different God. And their 10 Commandments now is 6, but they refer to it as the new 10 Commandments. And where do you think they store it? In the Ark of Hope, which is a Luciferian counterpart of the Ark of the Covenant. These things are not imaginary, they're real, but you can actually read the Earth Charter here. Do you ever wonder why we're allowing massive migration into the United States from south of the border? Why the President of the United States has refused to enforce the laws, which are the law of this land, and that is to protect us from unbridled migration. They will tell you we have about 12 million illegal immigrants in this country. Of course, they've changed the term. It's no longer immigrants, it's migrants. Isn't it amazing? It used to be illegal immigrants, then became immigrants, and now it's migrants. It's how they changed these terms. It used to be we had Christian charity, and then we had welfare, and now we have entitlements. So it is that we have migrants in this country. They will tell you there's 11 to 12 million. The figure is probably closer to 20 to 30 million illegal immigrants in this country that have been allowed to come in. It was in 1965 we began to change our immigration laws. Who was instrumental in that? A great American patriot named Teddy Kennedy, Senator Teddy Kennedy. For those of you who believe that there is a difference between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, let me point out that in the year 2003, the Bush Foundation, headed by George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush, gave their Man of the Year reward and, whatever appointment was, a selection and gift to that great American patriot, Teddy Kennedy. Wait a minute, I thought he was the bad guy. No, Teddy Kennedy couldn't get his No Child Left Behind legislation through. George Bush got it through. Teddy Kennedy couldn't get the drug Medicare bill through. George Bush got that through. All the programs we're carried out today are the programs of the radical left, being carried out by the conservative Christians in this country, and members of our House and Senate who are members of the Republican Party are going right along with the president, because if they don't, they won't get any money from the party leadership when they come up for re-election. But in 1965, they changed the immigration laws in America. Before that, we had the McCarran Immigration Act, which had predominant immigration from Europe, and Teddy Kennedy said, no, we've got to change this law, we shouldn't discriminate, we ought to let anybody come to America, and it's not going to change the demographics of our country. Well, of course, Teddy Kennedy, a word and about $5 to buy a cup of coffee anywhere in America, because he was simply lying to the American people. And they began to change the demographics, and so by 1986, they told us we had a million illegal immigrants in America. And what was the solution to the problem of illegal immigration in America? We'll make them all legal. There's only 1 million illegal immigrants in America, but we're going to pass new laws. We're going to reinforce the laws on the border. We're going to make it illegal for any employer federal crime to hire illegal immigrants. They have a catch and release program where they apprehend people at the border and they immediately release them to come back on their own recognizance for a deportation hearing, and you never guess what happens. Most of them don't show up. So they passed these laws in 1986, and they made the 1 million illegal immigrants legal, but there weren't 1 million, there were 3 million, and they lied. They simply lied to the American people, and that was under Ronald Reagan. And then in 1996, they passed another series of immigration laws, but they refused to enforce border security. They've maintained the check and release program until about a month ago, and now they say that they've done away with that. They're going to start, keeping the people that they catch. You realize they only catch 1 in 4 if you are a Mexican national, while you are immediately taken across the border and released so you can come back in again. If you are a foreign national, while you're, of course, given a schedule for a deportation hearing. Now remember, they're only catching 1 in 4. The other 3 get in, free, and once they get in, they become eligible in many states for welfare, for free education, for free medical care, for even subsidized housing. And they're actually subsidizing housing for people they know who are here illegal. The IRS knows who many of the people are because they're working, and they are paying Social Security taxes and using phony IRS numbers or Social Security numbers. They know exactly where they are, and they're refusing to enforce the laws. Why? Because they want to destroy the integrity of our nation. They want to flood it with people from other countries. They want a multilingual, multicultural society so they can play one group against another, so they can bankrupt our nation, so they can transfer our wealth to other nations. Now, if that sounds incredible, you need to read the Earth Charter, and we actually have it here. And you read it, point 10a says, equitable distribution of wealth within nations and between nations. Equitable distribution of wealth within nations means that they're going to redistribute your wealth to other people. They know exactly what they're doing. Now, you have to understand, they're not going to redistribute the wealth of the wealthy. It is simply people like you and me that they're going to redistribute the wealth on. But between nations, they're going to transfer America's wealth to other nations. That is why they have a planned program of sending our jobs overseas, our factories overseas, and bringing people into this country under special visas to take our high-paying jobs, only of course they're going to get low pay for it, but the plan is to impoverish the people of this nation, to destroy our pension structure, and to destroy the infrastructure of this once great nation. You need to read the plan. It's all there. In the Global Biodiversity Assessment, which came out of the Second Earth Summit, which was held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and Michael has referred to that, and we recommend, but we have a summary of that here. And then, of course, you need to read the Earth Charter. It's all there. I mean, it's public knowledge, but you're never going to hear about it because the media is controlled, and your minds are molded. Your ideas are formed, your tastes suggested largely by men you have never heard of. And the important thing is that you get the information, that you challenge what we say. How does this whole thing fit together? Well, we have a great video in the back. It's called The Secret Mysteries of America's Beginning. This was a documentary, and I have a small part in it, but it was actually submitted to the New York Film Festival. The documentaries are 1,000. This was the #1 prize. I bet you didn't read about it. Why? Because it goes into the secret societies that were here at the time America was founded. I mean, America was a Christian nation. It was formed by Christians, but there were secret societies here. They have always been here. Their goal has always been to take over control of our country and to use America's wealth and financial power to bring about a world government. My story, The Brotherhood of Darkness, you need to get this. This is the primary. We have, of course, a pamphlet on We Are a Republic. If you write to us or call us at our 800 number, we'll be glad to send you our catalog. You can listen to our programs 5 hours a day on the internet. If you have a satellite that can pull down Telstar 5, you can hear Al Jazeera on that as well. I mean, here's Al Jazeera, the terrorist satellite network, on an American satellite beaming their hate to, into Muslims' homes in America. Why do they allow that? Very simply, they want the Muslims to hate the Christians to hate the Muslims. If you don't have hatred, how are you going to get a war going? How are we going to get the Third World War going if we don't have everybody hating everybody else? And that's exactly what they're doing. And don't let them manipulate you into that. Most Muslims are good people. Al-Qaeda is a creation. If you read the book, we have it called The Devil's Game, you'll find out who financed Al-Qaeda. Your tax money from the very beginning. If you have any question what really happened on September 11th, you need to get the video back there called In Plain Sight, or go up on the internet and watch Loose Change. Understand what's going on, or better still, go onto the internet. There's a website called the Journal of 911 Studies. The professor who edits that journal is a man named Stephen Jones, who's been put on administrative leave at Brigham Young University because he tried to get the truth out, and anybody who tries to get the truth out will come under pressure, or as 3 of the people that I have had the opportunity to interview have been assassinated in America. The last one was a fellow named Gary Webb, who had been a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for the San Jose Mercury, wrote about the CIA's involvement in the drug smuggling and drug marketing in the United States. And Gary Webb, despite the fact he had a Pulitzer Prize and there was nothing wrong with his article at all, he is actually forced out of his job with the San Jose Mercury. And then he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head twice to make sure he was dead. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not talking about foolish little games. We're talking about the reality of what's going on. It's been said that some men die in foxholes and some go down in flames, but most men die just bit by bit, playing foolish little games. You have an obligation to be involved in this battle. if you are convinced that even part of what I say is right. You can listen to our programs 5 hours a day on the internet, on various networks, and it's all listed here on the front of this page. Your job is to tell others about what's going on, because believe me, there is a growing awareness across America. I've been in this battle for 44 years. I've never been as optimistic as I am today. We're moving into a climax in history, but we have right on our side. And our job is to stand for righteousness and to understand that there really are people who worship Lucifer, knowingly or unknowingly are working for Lucifer, and all you need to do is read what they say. And we simply quote their publications, and you can check them out. And if you want any documentation, we have it. And they're working, many of them, at the highest levels of our government today, to bring about a one-world government who will be ruled by the Prince of Darkness. Well, I'm reminded of what Martin Luther wrote many years ago, because Martin Luther recognized this same battle that we're engaged in today. And he wrote, "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power great, but armed with cruel hate, on earth is not his equal. Though the cause of evil prospers," and this is James Russell Lowell, "though the cause of evil prospers, yet his truth alone is strong. Though our portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong. But that scaffold sways the future, for in the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own." And so our plea to you, ladies and gentlemen, is become informed, become involved, because you're involved whether you want to be or not. And there comes a time when you'll either stand up and say no, or you'll be on your knees saying yes. There really is a plan for world genocide. There really are evil and wicked people out there. And there really is a God in heaven who will bless a nation that, of course, adheres to him. But remember those words of Thomas Jefferson, that God who gave us life gave us liberty. But can the liberty of a nation be secure when the conviction has been forgotten that liberty is the gift of God? I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice will not sleep forever. Thank you, and God bless you.